My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you here this evening. Our guest, Timothy Snyder, writes that the project of his new book, The Road to Unfreedom, is to delve in the Russian, Ukrainian, European, and American history as necessary to define the political problems of the present and to dispel some of the myths that enshroud them. While the book was many years in the making, the illiberal, oh my, I just skipped a whole portion of this. I just took so much cold medicine, I can't even tell you. While the book was many years in the making, the illiberal turn of so many European states as well as our own makes its publication all too timely. As some of you may know, Snyder has a knack for timeliness, as evidenced by his #1 bestseller, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, which was released in February 2017. He is also the author, among other books, of Black Earth, The Holocaust as History, and Warning, which the New Republic called a very fine book. Snyder identifies the conditions that allowed the Holocaust, conditions our society today shares. His many honors include the Hannah Arendt Prize, the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding. He is the Levin Professor of History at Yale, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Snyder to the Free Library.
Okay, good evening. Thank you, Andy. Thank you all so very much for choosing to share this part of your evening with me. The main theme of my recent work in On Tyranny and now in Road to Unfreedom is that history is a way of grounding ourselves. History is a way not only of understanding the past, but of understanding where we are now. If On Tyranny was a set of counsels, bits of advice, lessons from people wiser than myself, what I'm trying to do in Road to Unfreedom is set us firmly where and really when we are. What I'm after in this book, I'm going to tell you what's in the book, but let me tell you first what I'm after in this book. What I'm after in this book is to try to give us a grounding, a sense that things are not as strange as they seem, because they seem very strange, right? I mean, strange to the point of uncanny. It's strange, isn't it, that life expectancy in the United States is declining. It has declined for 2 years in a row, and I will be very surprised if it doesn't decline again for a third year. It's strange that there are more authoritarian regimes each year, that this is the trend all the way around the world. Some of us might think it's strange that that is, in some considerable measure, our fault, that the United States is making that more rather than less likely. It's strange that we're living in a country where the FBI has just raided the apartment of the lawyer, or one of the many lawyers, for lack of a better word, of the President of the United States. This is all very strange. And the strangeness, and here's where the argument of the book begins, the strangeness, I think, doesn't have to do with place. We're in the same place we were a few years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago. The strangeness has to do with time, and time is something that historians can help with. So the way I need to begin, the way I want to begin, but the way I need to begin this talk as well is by speaking about time. And this is going to seem abstract for a moment, but hopefully as I talk about it, it will start to sink in and make sense. We don't usually think about time, but we're always living within a certain idea of time. So for example, if you think time moves forward and things get better and there are certain rules to this, if you believe in something like progress, that's an idea of time. It's an idea of time that in the book I call the politics of inevitability. Things are just going to go a certain way. It doesn't matter so much what we as individuals do. What I want to suggest in the book, or what I argue in the book, is that that's a way of thinking about the world that Americans were bewitched by after the revolutions of 1989. When communism left the stage in the West, I think many of us persuaded ourselves that their story was wrong, and therefore our story is right. And therefore history is over. Remember that? Remember the part about history being over? Therefore, there are no alternatives to liberal democracy. Liberal democracy simply must spread outwards. Therefore, globalization is simply a matter of American normality being reproduced on a global scale. That's what I mean by the politics of inevitability. And it's important to see that as a sense of time, right? Because why? Because it can change. So if you're hit by something, say, for example, after 2008, you can no longer afford a house or an apartment, right? We live in a country where about 100,000 people are evicted from their apartments every month. Just in recorded cases, it's probably much more than that. If you're a Democrat, 2016 might have been a shock. And don't tell me it wasn't, you people, because I remember how surprised many of you were, right? I remember one of my colleagues Facebook posting in the middle of the night that we all have to stop drinking now because we have to face our kids in the morning, which was sad and poignant, but also spoke to a general condition. People were shocked. And so the thing about this, the thing about the politics of inevitability is, and this works if you're on the right or on the left, there are different versions, you can then be shocked. And when you're shocked, what comes next is this thing that I call in the book, and again, just give me a minute to try to explain this, the politics of eternity. When you no longer think everything automatically goes your way, it's very tempting to start to think, oh, okay, progress is not automatic. What happens is the same bad stuff happens over and over and over again. Oh, things are not generally getting better. What's happening instead is that they are always trying to get to innocent us. And time, instead of being a straight line into a predictable and predictably better future, becomes instead a kind of cycle where the same thing comes around over and over and over and over again. And I think in very broad terms, what we have to be able to do is to stop this change, which is underway, right? I don't have to, you know what, if I make America great again, is this kind of cyclical thinking, right? Using the 1930s era slogan, America First, is this kind of cyclical thinking. Turning public policy into a daily spectacle where all we experience is outrage or elation, depending upon our political preferences, is this kind of thing. It's turning time into something where you can no longer really think about the future. Right? Who is thinking about the future now? You can no longer really think about the future. You can no longer think about policy. Instead, you're just drawn into this cycle. So what I want to suggest is that faith in progress, putting it very briefly, is giving way to a sense of doom, right? On both the right and on the left. And that this is the thing that history can help us to stop. Because history can give us a much more sensible, much more grounded, much more factual sense of time. So how might this work? Well, the first thing history can do, and this is the beginning of the book, is that it can show what ideas are and that ideas do indeed matter. Part of the spell of the politics of inevitability is that ideas don't matter. Right? Everyone just cares about their material interests, and that's a good thing because that will eventually lead to progress. Capitalism will eventually bring democracy. Right? So, for example, let's say, for example, President Putin disinters the remains of a philosopher in Switzerland and has them flown back to Russia, and let's say he finds the papers of this philosopher at Michigan State University and has them brought back to Russia, and let's say President Putin cites this philosopher over and over and over again in his most important speeches at the most important junctures of his presidency, and let's say that this fascist was a very interesting fascist philosopher. Did I say fascist? I did. There's a quote on how often I'm going to say fascist, but he actually was a fascist. I mean, it's a good rule about the word fascist that you should only apply it to actual fascists. But that's an easier and easier rule to play by in the contemporary world. So Mr. Putin can do all this over the course of 10 years, and what do we say? We don't notice because ideas don't matter. Deep down, we say, he's just a pragmatist. He's just like the rest of us. He's only following his normally understood material interests. We don't notice when ideas are coming back. So I start the book with a very traditional bit of intellectual history, where I try to show what this philosopher actually stood for. He was a kind of classic philosopher of what I'm calling eternity. He says that Russia is fundamentally innocent, the rest of the world is fundamentally guilty. He says the only thing that happens in history is that over and over and over again, the corrupt, decadent outside world attacks Russia precisely because Russia is perfectly innocent. He says, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting for the 21st century and the daily experience that we have, he says, the facts of the world are irrelevant. The world is entirely sinful, right? So the experiences and the feelings and the facts of this world don't matter at all. It's therefore not a sin to lie or to deceive, because this world is already completely corrupt, except, of course, for Russia. Russia is the one hope of restoring things. And therefore, some kind of, let's say, cyber campaign to confuse and divide people around the world would be perfectly justified, so long as that's something which puts Russia back into the center of the world. Now, this is a very convenient set of beliefs to espouse if you happen to be an oligarchical clan, which if you are, this is your moment to get upset and say that, like, I'm not an oligarch, I'm a businessman, and it's not a clan, it's my family, you know. That was your chance, so don't get mad at me during the signing part, right? That was it. Okay, so if you are an oligarchical clan at the top of a state, this is a very convenient set of beliefs, because if you're an oligarchical clan at the top of a state, you can't really make policy. There's not going to be rule of law, which allows for a normally functioning market. You're going to be offshoring a tremendous percentage of the national wealth, right? Which will, by the way, allow you to make some interesting friends, like Mr. Trump. We'll get to that in a second. So what you need is an idea which explains why nothing ever changing is actually rather a good thing. You need a fascist account of politics which explains how every person has their own place in the system and that social advancement is possible, and nothing ever really changes. The only change is this cycle where the outside world is coming for you again and again and again, and of course that has to be resisted. So Mr. Putin begins to spread these ideas in 2011, 2012, not just at home, but also in a series of programmatic articles talking about what he's going to do when he becomes president again in 2012. And in these articles, which I talk about in chapter 3, Mr. Putin proposes an alternative to Europe. Okay, so why do I have to talk about Europe? Why can't I start talking about Mr. Trump right away? Here's why. Because this is all one history. The history of Russia, Ukraine, the European Union, and us in the 2010s, which is the subject of my book, it is all one story. Every piece fits together, but only if you see all of the pieces. One of the reasons why 2016 was so surprising to us was that we weren't noticing the things that had already happened in Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Russian and Ukrainian journalists who were here over and over again said, he's going to win, which seemed strange in contrast to the overwhelming consensus among American political scientists and sociologists and survey takers and right-thinking people everywhere, including at the top of the Trump campaign, right, for that matter. But one of the sets of people who thought that Mr. Trump would win were Russian and Ukrainian journalists who came here, recognized his style, who looked at the internet and recognized how robots work, right, and predicted that he would win. So this is all one story, and therefore Europe has to be in it. So bear with me for just a second, because this is important. Europe is the largest economy in the history of the world. The European Union's economy is bigger than ours, bigger than China's. Europe is the most important zone of contiguously bordered democracies in the world. Europe is next to Russia. We're not. When Mr. Putin comes to power, his most important opponent, or the most important target of his ideology, is the European Union. He proposes something called Eurasia. And what Eurasia is all about is this idea that we can have European integration, but European integration is not going to be on the basis of those boring rules and laws and treaties which make Europe rich and democratic, but instead it's going to be on the basis of civilization. right? It's going to be on the basis of virtues that Russia supposedly has and no one else has. In other words, let's have integration as a dictators club, which begins in Moscow and then goes to Kazakhstan and then to Belarus. And meanwhile, let's try to destabilize the actually existing European Union by supporting the Front National in France, later by supporting the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, by supporting in media in all kinds of other ways, Brexit in the United Kingdom, by supporting radical right-wingers throughout the continent. Let's try to make this large trade zone and this large zone of democracies fall apart and replace it with something called Eurasia. In the book, I spend a lot of time explaining the philosophy which is behind this. There are some very interesting ideas which Mr. Putin cites to justify this. Now, this all takes place at a time when not a whole lot is going on in American foreign policy, either towards Europe or towards Russia. This is the time of the American foreign policy reset to Russia. This is a time when President Obama is paying attention to China and East Asia, but not to Europe. This is a time when, if you remember, Mitt Romney, who I promise will not appear later as a hero in the story, this is his moment. This is a time when Mitt Romney says, correctly, Russia is our greatest geopolitical challenge. He was right, but when he said that, he was laughed out of school by everyone, by Democrats, by Republicans, by everybody when he said that. It was like it was a misprint, right, when he said that. That was 2012, and he was probably right. Now, this is also a very important moment when Mr. Trump enters the scene. Because in 2013, Mr. Trump is one of the American cheerleaders of this Russian turn towards a policy of civilization. Mr. Trump is one of the Americans who's called in 2013 to explain how everything is going very well in Russia. You might have overlooked it at the time because you weren't aware of how things were going to unfold. But in the summer of 2013, Mr. Trump, along with Richard Spencer, was one of the prominent Americans who defended Russian policy. Who's Richard Spencer? Right, okay, you know. Now you know. So you know that he's married to the translator of the most important Russian fascist. You know that, right? Okay. Now that okay. It's all one story. And Ukraine, above all, is part of one story. The way we looked at Ukraine in 2014 and 2015 was through the prism of our own politics of inevitability, right? Where President Obama says Russia's just a regional power. They don't have very much going for them economically. Of course, America is going to win. We don't have to do much except be passive aggressive, which is our strong suit in foreign policy. That's not a direct quote, by the way, of President Obama. It's a paraphrase, but I think you'll find if you read some of the rhetoric, it's not entirely unjust. But what Ukraine really was a very powerful example of how the politics of eternity, ours, opens us up to the politics of, the politics of inevitability, ours, opens us up to the politics of eternity. Because what Russia's trying to do in 2013, 14, 15 is that it's trying to draw Europe in general and Ukraine in particular towards the Russian politics of eternity, where there are just empires and there are just nations, there's no America, there's no European Union. They offer a very interesting story to Europeans, which appeals to the European politics of inevitability. Okay, I warned you I was going to talk about Europe. This is going to be it. It'll be over in a second. You can zone for a second if you want. What the Europeans think about the world is the following. They think that there was a Second World War. It was very bad. Europe learned from it. America didn't. Europe learned that war was a bad thing. Therefore, they have European integration. Okay? You may have, if you know Europeans, you may have heard that story. It's a good story for them because it makes us look bad, which is always fun. I'm going to turn the tables just here for a moment. That story is entirely wrong. There's not a word of truth in that story. Europeans did not learn from the Second World War that war was a bad thing. If they did, then the Russians, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, and the Jews would be the most peaceful people in the world because they're the ones who suffered during the Second World War. And we can agree or disagree about if it's the Belarusians or the Jews who are the most peaceful people in the world. But you see my point, right? The project of European integration starts in Western Europe. And it starts not because Europeans learned from the Second World War, which they didn't learn a thing from. Okay, I'm exaggerating slightly. They learned something from it. But it starts in Western Europe because the European Union is a project of post-empire. The European Union is where you go when your empire falls apart. The meaning of the Second World War is that Germany fails to achieve an empire in Eurasia. Then the Dutch and the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Belgians and the rest of them also lose their maritime empires, after which they join the European Union. They are never nation states. Why am I stressing all of this European history? Because the European politics of inevitability says, we were always nation states, we've been here forever, we learned from the Second World War, we're smart, we're wise, unlike you, we learned about European integration. The problem with that myths are fine most of the time, right? Like in most relationships, myths are okay. But then there come these moments of truth, which are called moments of truth for a reason, and we are in one of those moments of truth. What the Russians tell the Europeans in Brexit, with the Front National, with Alternative für Deutschland, with all the things they support is, yes, you were once nation states, and that was really good, right? There were never nation states. It never happened. It never happened, which is why Brexit is a step off the cliff into the unknown. There was never a Great Britain. There was a British Empire, and now there is Great Britain Integration Project, but there has never been a Great Britain. Never in modern history. There's been empire and there's integration. And the Russians get this, and they spin it in a certain way with the Europeans just like they do with us. And in Ukraine in 2014, 2015 was the crucial test, which we all failed. Or I don't mean you personally, I'm sure only most of you failed. But that whether we actually buy the politics of eternity, which is sold to us, or whether we have a sense that maybe something else is going on. Why is Ukraine so incredibly important? Because the Ukrainians wanted to get closer. The Ukrainians who were protesting in late 2013, 2014, they were protesting because they wanted to get closer to Europe. They wanted to get closer to Europe because they wanted the rule of law. Very boring, the rule of law. It's only the thing which enables us to have the free and prosperous lives that we have, right? Totally boring, rule of law, right? It's only the thing which separates us from complete tyranny at this moment, right? Totally boring stuff. So, the Ukrainians want the rule of law. That's why they want Europe. Russia invades Ukraine to stop this. And they tell us, oh, and by the way, the Ukrainian president, which turned away from the rule of law, had an advisor whose name was... Thank you! Thank you, because I was saying that 3 years ago. All right, sorry. Everything which happens in Ukraine is a test, a mental test. It's a stress test which we fail. It's a stress test that we fail. Everything that the Russians try, we go for. So the whole idea that in invading Ukraine, Russia is somehow reliving the Second World War, right? That it's against fascism, or that it's about defending the Russian language, even though they kill a lot of Russian speakers, or that it's about some kind of ancient history. It's about 1,000 years since the Christian conversion of somebody who never saw Moscow because it didn't exist at the time. These stories we went for, right? We went for these stories, and these stories are the politics of eternity. If you think in Ukraine it's about language and culture, you're not only saying those people are exotic and distant, you're also saying it's about these eternal things which always come around. It's not about what's actually going on in the world, which is a bunch of students who want to live European lives. It's about this fantasy, right? About a fantasy of civilization and culture, and we went for it. I mean, basically our whole press went for it. Our whole press goes for the maps with Ukraine split down the middle, with the Russian speakers on one side and the Ukrainian speakers on the other side. We went for that. And the fact that we went for it had consequences not so much for Ukraine as for us, because the same things that are played out in Ukraine in 14 and 15 are then played out here in 15 and 16. The very same things, although at a higher level of sophistication. So with respect to Ukraine, for example, Russia targets, using the internet, political susceptibilities. It says to the right wing, Ukraine is an artificial construction run by Jews. And the right wing says, how awful. And then it says to the left wing, Ukraine is an artificial construction run by Ukrainian fascists. And the left says, how awful. And the fact that those two things can't both possibly simultaneously be true doesn't matter, because internet communication is all about targeting people for their susceptibilities, right? Is this starting to ring any bells? Everything which happens is like this. So consider how Putin treats the war in Ukraine. What is Putin's information strategy? He says, We never invaded. They invaded 3 times: February of 14, August of 14, January of 2015. 3 major Russian incursions. There's still Russian presence. We never did it, right? He simply denies the most basic facts and then changes the subject to some kind of outrageous fiction. And our press has a lot of trouble handling that, right? That's another thing which is a kind of, which presages what's going to come next. What we see in Russia in general at this time is what I would call strategic relativism. The basic idea is that Russia, under an oligarchical regime, cannot do better, right? It can't promise its citizens more. What it can do is it can make things in other countries worse, right? You can turn international politics from a positive-sum game into a negative-sum game, and then you try to lose the negative-sum game by less than other people are losing it, right? Which is what, in fact, is happening. So, what we then see is that on the Russians' own account in 2014, what they're doing in Ukraine is not something which is exotic and distant from us. By the account of the Russians themselves, what they're doing in their campaign against Ukraine is campaigning against us. The Russian officer who's in charge of security in Ukraine in the summer 2014 says that Ukraine and the United States are similar in that they are both disintegrating states. Putin's advisor for Eurasia in September 2014 says that in order to win the war in Ukraine, we have to, let me make sure I get this right. What's the word he uses? We have to, exterminate, that was it. We have to exterminate the American elite. Okay, big words. Big words maybe didn't sound so plausible in 2014. But my point here is that from their point of view, whether we notice it or not, this was all one struggle. The timing is very revelatory. The Internet Research Agency gets off the ground, right? Starts working against us at the same time Russia invades Crimea. In summer of 2015, the Internet Research Agency is gearing up on 2 big projects. The first is confusing people about the Russian incursion in Ukraine, and the second is it's starting an American department where they're going to support the candidacy of Donald Trump in the United States of America. The candidacy to become the Republican nominee, by the way, right? This is not about the general election, it's about the Republican nominee. So this brings me to the part of the talk where I am going to talk for a moment about the US, and then I'm going to make sure we have some time to talk amongst ourselves. So when we get to the US, I'm going to now try to answer a question which I think is very important that we answer it right. The question is the problem Russia or is the problem us, right? And the answer is, why choose, right? The answer is Russia reveals our problems. And that's the positive and constructive way to read the Russian intervention. If you deny that the Russian intervention happened, you're making a terrible, terrible mistake. If you deny that America was vulnerable for reasons having to do with our own weaknesses, you're probably making a graver mistake. So what I try to do in chapter 6 is show how American vulnerabilities and Russian strategies came together to bring about the outcome that we have. So, on the one hand, yes, clearly Mr. Trump would not be where he is without Russian help. I go through the details in the book. I'll be very brief here. He would not exist as a public figure in the United States without Russian help. He's a public figure in the US capable of standing for office because he plays a businessman on TV. Which is interesting in itself, by the way. I mean, this is something I think about a lot. I know a lot of successful businessmen, and none of them could play a successful businessman on TV. Right? And yet, nevertheless, when we see someone playing the successful businessman on TV, it occurs to us that he might actually be a successful businessman, right? Which is the last thing that should occur to us. But nevertheless, we kind of go for it, which is itself an American vulnerability, right? Okay, so of course, without Russia's financial bailout of Mr. Trump in the 90s and then the 2000s, he would not exist. He would not be there spreading birtherism without Russia. which also independently spread birtherism. He would not be there as a public figure without Russia, let alone the Republican nominee, let alone the candidate. He would not exist without them. And of course, during the campaign, we all know this story. I tell it in detail in the book. He would not have existed without financial support, that is, shell companies buying his assets. He would not exist without hacking support by two Russian intelligence agencies. He would not exist without social media support, which was massive. You might remember that in 2016, Democratic strategists kept saying, Mr. Trump is not actually running the campaign. Right? He's not running the campaign. So this is confusing to us. No, he was not running the traditional campaign, but he had associates who were running a very effective, untraditional campaign that worked. As far as the traditional campaign was concerned, it's very striking how pretty much everybody that was involved, from Paul Manafort downward, had some very weird financial, political, and or emotional connection to the Russian Federation, right up to Trump himself. You know, it's odd. I find it odd. I mean, I lay this all out in the book, but I find it odd how much proof we need about this. I mean, it's like a story where like your friend is being humiliated by, you know, their lover, and like there's all this evidence that things have gone terribly wrong, and yet your friend is saying, you know, but I haven't. Okay, you know where I'm going with this. Like, I mean, Trump retweeted Russian material. Right? He retweeted Russian material. Our Secretary of Commerce has a personal financial stake in a company which is Russian crony capitalism. Just over and over again, there are things which are just so striking that it is uncanny that we can't bring all the pieces together. One of the things I do in the book is I try to bring it all together. Page, Papadopoulos, Sessions, Flynn, Kushner, Trump Jr., Trump Sr. I try to bring it all together. So on the one hand, without Russia, no Trump. That's totally obvious. But on the other hand, without our own vulnerabilities, Russia doesn't have a target. Russia is like a bad doctor. Russia is like the doctor that diagnoses your illnesses in order to make them worse. But the diagnosis is correct. You want to have that clipboard because on that clipboard is a correct account of what's actually wrong with you. Our belief that pure capitalism would bring about always good political outcomes has been disproven by offshoring, right? Without the offshoring of wealth, without the anonymous real estate companies, without the shell companies, without the legal ability of banks to do business with clients whose names they don't know, the relationship between Mr. Trump and the Russian Federation could never have arisen, right? It's a relationship which began with money laundering and grew from there. So Mr. Trump's relationship with the Russian Federation is one example of the way that totally unregulated capitalism can go wrong. Our belief that technology was always going to bring enlightenment has also been proven to be incorrect, right? That was a weakness which we created for ourselves. There was no particular reason to think that except for our own propaganda. Our belief that the market is the best way to sort out healthcare, I think, has also turned on us pretty clearly. Not just in the obvious ways, but think about this. Every county in Pennsylvania that Mr. Trump flipped from Obama is an opioid crisis. Every county in Ohio that Mr. Trump flipped from Obama, except for one, is in opioid crisis. The counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, Michigan, where Mr. Trump gained significantly more votes than Mr. Romney, are in opioid crisis. There are many reasons why we have an opioid crisis, but one of them is our free market approach to healthcare. Right? There's a very direct and sad connection there, I'm afraid. And maybe most fundamentally is inequality. The politics of inevitability makes excuses for inequality. It says there are no alternatives. If we reach levels of wealth inequality that are greater than 1929, the politics of inevitability says that's normal. That's just the way things are. There's not really anything the state can do about it, even if Canada to our north or other countries that are similar to us do manage to do things about it. And that was the critical demographic that pushed Mr. Trump across, of course, right? He got traditional Republican voters, and he also got people who were not traditional Republican voters, who for reasons of class and also race voted for him. Race, another American vulnerability, which the Russians know about and which the Russians played, right? The Electoral College, they knew to throw all of their weight at Michigan and Wisconsin at the last minute, and they did, right? So the things that look to us as though they're normal or they're just part of our rules of the game. There are specific American particularities. From abroad, they look like vulnerabilities. They look like an attack surface, to use the cyber war lingo. When they are an attack surface, they were attacked. So this amounts to a kind of dark globalization. It wasn't that America had democracy figured out and that our version of democracy had to spread around the world. On the contrary, in the 2010s, we became a less democratic country across pretty much any way you want to measure this. It's not just me, by the way. This is Freedom House talking, which is not the most traditionally anti-American institution in the country. In 2010, allowing corporations to participate in elections like people, nobody thinks that's democratic, right? Including the people who started the lawsuit. 2013, allowing southern states to pass voter suppression laws without previously checking them with the courts. That has not helped democracy. 22 states have since passed voter suppression laws. And of course, the vast inequality. So what our own problems created a vulnerability, a very real vulnerability, which has hit us. So let me just close. I want to make sure we have time to talk. So the point of this book was to write a history of the present, because the present is a moment in time. It's not easy to write a history of the present. I mean, for one thing, you have to watch a lot of television, which is no. I mean, aside from like the inherent displeasure of it, it's really slow. It's so slow. Like people talk about how the internet is so fast. I don't know. But if you actually want to get anything out of like visual sources, you have to spend your whole afternoon, right? In an archive, you could go through boxes and boxes of material. You could figure out Anschluss or the American Revolution. Well, in the same amount of time it takes you to figure out Putin's strategy in Crimea on March 13th or whatever. But it's hard to write a history of the present, but here's why I think it's necessary. Because we need to get historical time back. We need to get, what's democracy good for, after all? Democracy is about producing historical time. That's what it's about. That's what it's for. Democracy translates all of our individual mistakes into a collective sense that there is a near future. Because we can go off and we can, if we have a democracy, we can all go off and vote for the wrong people, and then we can blame them, knowing that 2 years or 4 years down the line, we can do it all again. That's not the most cheerful kind of democracy, but it's the fundamental one. That's why democracy keeps us going. That's how democracy, and literally that keeping us going is the crucial thing. If you believe in automatic progress, you're not going to have a democracy. If you believe in eternity, if you believe in doom, you're also not going to have a democracy. So the things that are working against our democracy, both at home and abroad, are all about our sense of time. Getting democracy back is about getting that sense back that not everything is so weird. Not everything is so uncanny. And so what I try to do at the very end of the book is to suggest that I'm not just writing about what happened, I'm writing about the virtues, and I use this word unironically now. I'm writing about the virtues that are involved, the virtues that we've seen lost or sacrificed or put at risk needlessly. The history of the 2010s, in my account, is a history of the event that I've described. It's a history of Russia and Ukraine and Europe and the US, but it's also a description of virtue. It's suggesting the things that we might need to actually have a democracy in this country or elsewhere. It goes through the virtues of individualism, of succession, of integration, of novelty, of truth, and of equality. And it tries to suggest that these are, modest or immodest, these are the good things that we need to aim for. Because again, totally ironically now, I think we need history to see good and evil. If we just have inevitability, if we just believe in progress, then we don't have to ask what the good thing is, because it's what we have and we're just going to get more of it. If we believe in doom, if we believe in eternity, we don't have to ask what the good things are, because it's the other side which is always evil, and therefore we're always innocent, and therefore we're always good. And so we don't have to ask, right? One of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to ask what it is that we're losing and try to give an answer. Thanks.
If your very interesting and entertaining presentation moves forward in time and becomes the report of the special counsel, many people in the room will feel vindicated and very happy. My question for you is, how do you see what the special counsel is doing, and how likely is it, in your opinion, that his investigation will eventuate in the kind of report that you've given us in terms of the money laundering and the background of the Russian and the strategy that you laid out for us. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, naturally, like when you write a book about the 2010s as a historian, then the next thing people want is the history of the 2020s. I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to come at it from from three lateral positions. The first is that the Mueller report is possible. The whole investigation is only possible because of reporters. I dedicate this book to reporters, and that's for a reason. What I know as a student of Russia and Ukraine is that even if you only have a few investigative reporters, that's so much more than none. And that the investigative reporters, the good ones, the honest ones, have been doing the reporting of kleptocracy. They've been doing the reporting of the dark money, of the offshoring in Russia and Ukraine, and then here. And it's the same. The people who do that then end up being the good war reporters, because those are the two main stories in that part of the world. But without Russian and Ukrainian reporters, I wouldn't have been able to write this book. And it's not too much to say that without Russian and Ukrainian reporters, there wouldn't be a Mueller investigation. We're now in the midst of a renaissance of American investigative journalism, which is indispensable and extremely important. Reporters for The Guardian, for The Washington Post, for The New York Times, and also for non-traditional places like BuzzFeed have done unbelievably important investigative work. And without that, there's no Mueller investigation. Because as great as those 9 guys, or however many, and women, I don't even know how many there are, this shows something, but as great as they are, they're not figuring it all out for themselves. It's not just the facts, it's also the concepts have to come from somewhere, and it's the reporters. And I want to stress that it's the international reporting. Where this actually goes it has to do with being able to learn things from other places like Kiev and Moscow. And reporters like Frank Foer, for example, were writing about this a long time ago. Without that in the background, Frank Foer is writing about Manafort and Trump and Russia in the summer of 2016. Without that background, we wouldn't be able to even process what the Mueller investigation is. The third thing I want to say is that I think it's very important not to treat the Mueller investigation as a thing in itself. So I'm, as you can tell, I'm very much a believer in the rule of law, and I think the real contest in this country now is not, at this moment, it's not about democracy or not. I would like to see us become much more of a democracy. I think that's the good work of the years and decades to come. But right now, where we're hanging on is rule of law or no rule of law. I think that's where we're hanging, and that's what Mueller stands for, right? I'm sure I wouldn't agree with Mr. Mueller about all kinds of things, but I believe that he cares about and is trying to represent, in every sense of that word, the rule of law. And whether we have the rule of law in this country isn't going to depend just upon him. It's going to depend upon whether we act like we expect it, and whether we act like we expect investigations to continue. So we can't just leave him and his team of lawyers off on their own and say, you are a well-dressed magic bullet. You're a nice conservative establishment magic bullet. The country, or at least a lot of the country, has to convey the sense that we actually care about the rule of law, and not just about the things that he finds out. So, I can't answer your question in literal form because I'm not involved with it, right? I've tried to figure things out in my own way. And in my own way started with Russia and Ukraine and ended up landing in the U.S. And insofar as I saw some things ahead of other people, I was the first person to write about Trump and Putin, for example. But insofar as I've seen things earlier than other people, it's because of that little bias. I think that helps because, in general, now in the last 10 years, things happen in Russia and Ukraine first and here second. And we weren't ready for that, but that's how it's been. Okay, so long answer. I circled around, kind of, but hope it was useful.
Would you comment on how the politics of inevitability are really not the same? The nationalist parties believing that we had nations, and since I grew up in France, I tend to believe that's what I was convinced of, that France was the youre nation. But I think the results have not been the same, except perhaps in Italy. But so the politics of inevitability seem to me different in the United States, much more guided by its own belief in exceptionalism than they are in the European Union. And since I appreciated your talk enormously, I would like you to comment.
Yeah, so first of all, the politics of inevitability is a pattern but it can have different examples. So communism, for example, was also a politics of inevitability. If you think changes in the means of production lead to changes in class structure, lead to class struggle, lead to the victory of the proletariat, leads to, that if you have a kind of primitive Engelsian or Leninist version of Marxism, no, Engelsian rather, if you have a primitive version of Marxism, that's also a politics of inevitability. And for me, like the great irony of '89 is that the Americans and the Europeans look on at the demise of a politics of inevitability, and instead of saying all these stories are wrong, they say that story is wrong. And for me, that's like the founding intellectual sin. Secondly, the ways that the content of the politics of inevitability are different matter too, right? My view in this book is that all politics of inevitability are vulnerable to politics of eternity. They all set up their own contradictions, their vulnerable points. And those vulnerable points are different. In the US, it has much more to do with inequality. In the EU, I think it has much more to do with complacency. And I would even say a certain kind of exceptionalism, like we're the only people who've learned that war is bad, something like that. That is actually a kind of exceptionalism, which one sees more in Germany than elsewhere, but I think it's European. But I agree with you, it has a different flavor, but I'm not sure I completely agree about the outcome. What I think is that we're all riding this wave, and that the different outcomes in different places are often just a matter of luck or even sequence, right? The fact that Mr. Trump won in November of 16, I think made it harder on the Dutch populists and the Austrian ones. Just the simple fact that Trump had won, because it's hard to be both anti-American and a national populist at that moment. It gets confusing. But also, Mr. Trump's victory made certain things real. I think the fact that the Brexit referendum took place made it a little bit harder, for other populists. But in general, even in Europe, I mean, Marine Le Pen lost, but she got a stunning percentage. A stunning percentage. I mean, almost twice as much as her father. And I don't think this doesn't go remarked enough. The fact that in the first round of the elections, she beat every single traditional candidate, right? The only person who beat her was another untraditional candidate, right? But, what if he's hit by a tram? Or whatever, what if he falls under the metro? I mean, which God forbid, right? I don't wish the man ill. But Marine Le Pen did very well. Even in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland only wins 13.5%, but no German far-right party has won that much since 1933, right? Literally. So even in Hungary and Poland are also different forms of all of this. So I agree with you that they have different content, and the content matters, but I'm not sure that. I think America may have just had a bit more bad luck in some respects. And my basic posture here is that we need to be, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree, we need to be learning one from another at this time. This is the worst moment for the Europeans to be saying, oh, look at this specifically American thing that's happening, or for the Americans to be saying, oh, look at those crazy polls, right? Because the underlying pattern, I think, is very similar.
Thank you very much for your book. I'm Ukrainian, so I know what you're talking about. We were in that revolution. We were rallying here in 2013-14. My question is, specifically, what is your opinion about free speech in America? Because I think that philosopher you talk about, which talked about extermination, Dugin, right? The Russian philosopher.
That was actually Glaziev.
Yeah, but even another one, they had an arena here in United States. They were invited to universities, and often I am very amazed that people accept hate speech as a free speech, and people can tell obvious lie, and you even can name this as a lie. So what is your opinion, and what do you think, how it affects the democracy in general? Thank you.
Okay, that's a very big topic. So with free speech, I'm very much in favor of free speech, but I'll tell you why I'm in favor of free speech. I'm in favor of free speech because I believe that it's something which enables an individual to become an individual. It allows a person to become an individual. The ability to express and then to meaningfully interact with others helps you to become you and me to become me, which I mean is happening right now before our eyes. That's why freedom of the speech is so important. It's not important because if everybody says everything that they feel at a given moment, the truth will emerge. right? That's a bad account. That's a bad defense of the freedom of speech. It's a classical one, and it's one that humors us because if we really think like a free market in noise making leads to truth, that would suggest that we're very rational, which we're not, right? So one argument people make in favor of the freedom of speech, for example, Twitter makes this argument and Facebook makes this argument, is that the more stuff you have out there, right, however wrong or not wrong it is, the more stuff you have out there, the more likely it is the best ideas will rise to the top, which was wrong when Milton said it, and it's wrong now, right? That's, for me, not an argument for freedom of speech. And this is relevant because in terms of, I'll get to the college campuses, but in terms of the internet, to me, it's not freedom of speech if a robot like amplifies 1,000 times something which wasn't true in the first place, right? And the idea that that's going to somehow create truth strikes me as completely ludicrous. Truth is really hard to get to, and it requires discipline, it requires teaching, and it also requires a certain amount of attitude. And one of the things that I think, I expect from the younger generation is to make factuality cool again, right? Make factuality cool again. Because whole swaths of the U.S. population are, I'm afraid, just lost on this. And if the kids don't come through and say, like, we're going to actually figure things out for ourselves, then I don't think actually democracy is possible in those conditions. So, which brings me to campuses. So I believe very much that that campuses are not only a place where there should be free speech. I think without campuses there won't be free speech. I mean, so I have a kind of inverted opinion about all this. I hear people talk about campuses as though, like, U.S. campuses are the place where it's hard to talk, and the rest of the country it's fine, right? I gotta say, like, my experience is exactly the opposite. I mean, when I travel around the U.S., I find people all the time who are hindered by various things from saying what they think, right? Whereas university is the time in the student's life where they can actually try to say the things that they actually might think or feel, which are often, dumb. But the point is that then they go off and they get a job and they stare at a screen, and it's harder for them to say what they actually think, right? Campuses are also one of the only places where people are exposed to very different kinds of ideas. Just the academic disciplines that's a whole range of ideas which are very different than what you're going to get from television or whatever. So I think campuses actually produce, as it were, and export free speech, and that if we didn't have the University of North Carolina or Ohio State or Indiana, those places are much more important than like Yale or whatever. If we didn't have our big, great state institutions, we would have a very hard time having a national discussion. But in terms of the hate speech, free speech thing, I mean, here's what I think. We have the right to talk, but we don't have the right to talk wherever we want to, right? I mean, I'm here because I was invited to be here. If I decide that I want to give a speech, in the mayor's office tomorrow at 6 a.m. in the presence, maybe your mayor goes to work at, but you see what I mean. Like, free speech is not the same thing as that you can invite yourself anywhere you want to any venue. And that's, for me, that's the common confusion, right? So Alexander Dugin has the right to free speech. He talks all the time, right? He's got his own like video show, which is sponsored by Malofeev. He's got his own. He has free speech. But the fact that he has free speech doesn't require me to invite him to Yale. Right? It's just a kind of basic misunderstanding. If people are invited to universities, there should be a reason why they're being invited to a university, right? It's not appropriate for everybody to be giving a talk at a university. That doesn't mean they don't have free speech. They can give a talk somewhere else, or they can write a book, or they can do whatever they want. So the whole free speech issue in the U.S. strikes me as a bit of a trap for universities, because what is now happening is that people will extract a Spencer or a Dugin, and they'll put him in the face of a University of Pennsylvania or University of Cincinnati or whatever it is, and say, if you don't allow my favorite fascist to speak at your campus, then you don't believe in free speech. And then university administrators get themselves all tied up in knots about this, right? But I think it's pretty simple. I mean, a university is not the place for your favorite fascist. It's a place for your favorite economist or your favorite philosopher or whatever it be, but your favorite fascist, not necessarily. I mean, they can actually, if they can found Fascist U. It's a free country. You could start Fascist U. You could have the Dugin chair in schizofascism, and you could roll from there.
So what do you think history can teach us about why we watched the kind of Republican primary that we watched in 2015? And where were we as a society were we like too fragile or something? Where would our immunity basically to fall into this, let's say, trap basically?
Okay. So, I mean, I've said the most important things, so I'm going to just repeat them. I think the United States, like everybody else, is going to be more vulnerable to drastic changes in politics when people who expect better get worse. So a very specific thing happens in the United States, which is that white males of a certain generation especially are doing much worse than they expect. And that has to do with race. I mean, people get all tied up about, like, is it race, is it class? It's obviously both. People have different expectations of the state and of the economy, depending on where they're coming from in culture or race. But what happened is that because of radical inequality, a lot of people who were expecting a lot from the state and from the economy got a lot worse, got a lot less than they expected. And those were actually the decisive voters who put Mr. Trump in office. And so there's a class, I mean, the basic lesson is whether you're a Republican who lost control of your party, right, which they did completely, or whether you're an American who's wondering about this, is you don't want to have radical inequality. You don't want to have growing inequality. You don't want to repeat 1929 like it was a success story, because it wasn't. The second thing has to do with media. So we run the presidential campaign as if it's a media contest. And that means that people who are trained in media are likely to win, right? The reason why Mr. Trump had a huge advantage was that he basically got the American television networks. I mean, even like Russia has nothing to do with this, right? He got the American television networks to treat him seriously. Why? Because they were looking for an entertainer, and he was an entertainer. So I forget the numbers now, but I remember the Twitter numbers. Even the Twitter accounts of the television networks, which Mr. Trump calls fake news, they tweeted about him twice as often as they tweeted about Secretary Clinton, right? And without that, I don't think he's plausible. I mean, this is now the primary season we're talking about. So I mean, those are the basic things. There's a third thing that I would like to mention, which is the absence of local news. There now seems to be an international consensus that when you lose local news, people are more vulnerable to big stories that seem to explain everything. And for Republican primary voters and for Americans in general, Mr. Trump very ably supplied big stories that explain everything. You need a wall, right? You can't have this woman, you need a wall. There was another story. There were three of them. Swamp, wall, what was the other one? Anyway, he had big stories that explained everything. Yeah. So and so one thing we can learn is that changes of media are very destabilizing, and that it's very important to think, I think, particularly about connecting people with where they live with news. So one of the things I'd like to see happen out of this Facebook and Silicon Valley, catastrophe that we're going through, is to ask them to do something constructive. So it's easy to okay, now we're all mad at Amazon, It's easy to do that, and it's easy to give in to say well, they did all this bad stuff, because they did. But how can we turn that around? And one thing that I've been thinking about is how could we for example, how could we tax so that if you're in the information producing sphere, you have to then subsidize the education of local journalists? Because the main thing that happened, the thing which was special about 2016 was that it was the first presidential election after the wipeout of American local news, which happened in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, right? So those are things which come to, maybe you meant something more tactical, like how the Republicans, yeah, I'm going to stay at the general level.
First of all, I just want to say that the fact that you're still alive truly gives hope of me, or it just shows that...
My wife says the same thing all the time.
Or that, unfortunately, truly tragically, given the depth and extraordinariness of your analysis, academicians aren't taking that seriously. That's just But that's a prologue. But please take care of yourself. But I want to give
I feel like that wasn't a question.
Right, no, that wasn't a question. That was a prologue. I want to give you a choice in questions since time is short. Number one, would it be possible for you to, productive for you to explain why there were never really nation states? Because I don't get that.
Yeah.
Or do you want to talk about the Middle East in this putting the puzzle together?
Okay, I'm going to say something about nation states. So and it goes back a bit to this question, because it's tricky, because what I mean by nation state is, imagine you have a territorially bounded entity where all the citizens are equal. Okay, so France was not that in 1789. I mean, there was a revolution, you know, some heads were chopped off, but France was an empire then. Right? France was an empire at that time. It was an empire before and after the revolution. I mean, it called itself a republic and then an empire, but this is what I mean. The Netherlands was an empire, Portugal, Spain. They were empires. They weren't states where all citizens were the same class. They were empires where there was inequality of subjecthood or of citizenship. And that remains true until the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, which are the years when people joined the European Union. So the story that the Europeans tell about themselves is extremely convenient, because it allows them, when you say, you know, our ancestors, the Gauls, when you imagine that you were always a nation state, that allows you to completely marginalize the whole history of empire, right? That you lost wars, that you committed atrocities. That doesn't have to be in your history, because you were always a nation state, right? And so that's also how it works out morally. Right, so now the Americans then are left as the only empire, because who ever heard of the Belgian Congo, right? So that's the first thing. I mean, as for like the safety thing, I just want to say this: there are people out there. This goes back to what I said to this gentleman. There are people out there, you know, Russian and Belarusian and Ukrainian and other reporters who are covering issues where real personal risk is at stake, and we all owe them something. I just wanted to say that.
Given the lens through which you view history, which you've described here today, if you were the advisor to the next president, hoping it's anyone other than Trump, what would you advise him to do differently?
So I'm gonna take that question in a completely different way, because I think it's very, very important not to imagine that the change in personnel is the crucial thing. So, like, that's a mistake that, you know, that we have made and others have made so often, that as soon as the bad person is gone, then, you know, things are going to be better. The kinds of things that need to change in the U.S. are going to have to be done at local, state, as well as national levels. And there are some fundamental things like the state of Delaware, if you're out there, the anonymous registration of companies has got to stop. There are 200,000 companies registered at a single Delaware address. That is directly related to the rise of Mr. Trump. And it's not just Mr. Trump, it's that this allows for the internationalization of dark money, which just cannot be good for anybody. It's not good for the Russians whose money is stolen either, and it's not good for us whose candidates are chosen. So, I mean, I think we have to become a more democratic country piece by piece by piece, so we can legislate about stuff like that, which may seem at first glance really, you know, tertiary to the whole issue, but I think is actually fundamental. So, I mean, I know that there's this big discussion about who's going to be the Democratic nominee, and a lot of my friends and colleagues are very excited about 2020, and, you know, but for me, it's much more about little victories which accumulate and which lead to changed attitudes and changed legislation, and like that, it's at that level which I'm trying to work. If it happens, I'll think of something.